Angela Carter was a good-for-nothing, rubbish writer who couldn't think of a single original thing to write about, and therefore stole from the Grimm brothers and traditional fairy tales from German heritage. Is what an idiot with no brain cells would say. However, me, containing at least 2 brain cells, loves Angela Carter, and this is a video in defense of her very cool, somehow original, even though it's using these traditional tales, original writing, and she's just doing things that no one else was doing in the 1970s, 1960s. For women, for writing, for magical realism, for magical non-realism, just for magic, storytelling, short tales. I think it's really important that we still have writers whose thing is that they can adapt and they can write long novels, short novels, and short tales. I enjoy a short tale. There's nothing wrong with a book that just has 10 short little tales that are like barely 20 pages long. You know, some of Carter's tales are barely 8 pages long. If you do that well, that's incredible, and that's an incredible feat. So, today I want to talk about imitation and intertextuality, basically. And obviously we're going to get onto women because we can't talk about Carter without talking about the women. But yeah, I wanted to first talk about, obviously, that was an intense intro, guys. I'm really sorry about that. Obviously, a lot of Carter's fairy tales and short tales, especially in The Bloody Chamber, which is definitely her most famous work by far, she is imitating and using and retelling traditional fairy tales, primarily from the Grimm's brothers, but obviously they were imitating other people as well if you look deeper into the history, etc, etc. So we'll just say from the fairy tale canon and genre, she was taking those tales and retelling them. And I think it's a really interesting concept to think about. Obviously, intertextuality has always been a thing. You can't write a piece of anything without stealing from someone or being inspired, or, you know, the piece reminds the person reading it of another author. That's just the way that writing works. We're borrowing and feeding into each other's ideas. But I think in the 21st century, I've seen a lot of narrative of like, this book is the same thing that I've read 10 million times before, like no one's original anymore. And I think we see it a lot in sort of, I hate to say the word because I feel like it does demonise the masses and their pop culture enjoyment, but anti-intellectualism and the rise of those really specific romance novels where the covers are just like those cartoon people. And I see a lot of people arguing like, oh, you know, the front's cartoon, there's no like personality, originality to it. All the stories are the same. And I completely get that. People can become fed up of narratives. But I think that is very different to what Carter is doing, because I think the regurgitation of media that we're experiencing at the moment, it's because of the rapidity of it and because no one wants to tweak anything with their material or rehash it in a certain way. It's just we go into Waterstones and into the romance section or other sections as well. Again, I don't want to demonise the romance genre because it is great, but there'll be like 40 books and they've all got the same kind of cartoon cover and the same premise of like helpless girl meets boy and falls in love with boy, or like, you know, there's like 20 of them about sports and then 20 of them about science and 20 of them about cooking or whatever, you know, and it becomes very, very repetitive. But that notion of copying is not the same as rehashing, imitation and intertextuality. These are nuanced things that authors spend a lot of time thinking about and deciding to do and picking, right? Like, it's a massive choice for Carter to be like, I'm going to speak fire in the present tense because it's just either, you know, I want to take these Grimm's tales and retell them and rehash them, rather than just saying, oh, I want to keep this narrative going that's exactly the same. Because you read them and it's not the same, right? We know that. It's the same when I write an essay in my first year of my undergrad degree, and it's probably the same essay that hundreds of undergrad students have written before me, probably the same terrible essay that our tutors are thinking this is awful, but they're all slightly different, right? I'm going to start with a different intro, I'm going to look at different critics, maybe we've all looked at the same critic but I'm looking at it in a different way, or I'm disagreeing with them when someone else agrees with them. At face value, yes, this is imitation and copying and mirroring, but once you look deeper into it, the nuances are incredibly important, and that's what makes it an original work. But I hate the word original because nothing is original, right? And if you look back even to the Renaissance, learned, intellectual, smart people were praised for being able to imitate. If you could write something that sounded like Homer or sounded like Virgil or used like the metrical scheme or different like metaphors that other really important writers had used in the past, that made you a really impressive scholar and that made you an intelligent person. I don't think we should equate copying and imitation with being non-intellectual. I think that's just kind of a dumb concept. I think in the 21st century we're kind of like wanting this originality that just has never existed and will never exist. Everything's an imitation and a mirroring or an iteration of something, okay? I just want to get that as like the basis. Yeah, so I think there's a certain falsity and there's definitely an allure to originality. It would be so cool if I came out with a book that was so original and it was its own genre, blah blah blah, but the only person I can think of the top of my head who's actually done that is probably Mary Shelley with Frankenstein and creating the science fiction genre. The rest of them, romance has been here since the beginning of time. Tragedy, heroes, villains, fairy tales, being interested in the stars and God. These are just normal things that humans think about, that we talk about all the time and all the time and all the time. So I feel like we need retellings. I don't think it's ever boring to retell a story or to redo something, and that's what Carter's doing. She took original fairy tales and was like, let me just retell them. And obviously primarily Carter is known for being a feminist author. She has rewritten these fairy tales through a feminist lens, and it's not this same plot, it's just a very similar, very recognisable plot, which means that when she tweaks bits it becomes so much more profound and so much more moving for us because it's not following the trajectory that we're used to, right? So I think if you're imitating something, you can go one of two ways. The two that I can think of is either to keep the exact same thing that you're imitating, do it the exact same way, but the style or something about it just makes it interesting enough for that not to be boring or like copyrighted in a sense, in a metaphorical sense. Or you can take the story and tweak bits or change the end or change something massive about it. So for example, gender flipping characters, people really like to do that in drama when they're doing The Tempest for the 1 millionth time in the world. Someone might gender flip the characters and that makes it new and interesting. I think Carter's kind of doing a little bit of both. She's dabbling because her style is so interesting as well. Obviously she's a modern / postmodern writer, whatever you want to describe those things, as I mentioned that in the last video. But her style is kind of, she's not writing pompously or being really metaphorical and using lots of really alluring language. The language isn't simple, but I think that the syntax can be, in the sense that I don't read Carter and think, oh, I don't know what half of these words mean, or I'm not sure where she's going with this. I feel like I can kind of tell. Obviously there's exceptions to that, my view, but I feel like her simple syntax largely allows for great exposure to the sexual freedom that she's trying to narrate, because we have this simple plot, this recognisable plot, paired with a simple syntax and a simple narrative, and like it's very easy to visualise the stories that she's telling us. So when there's these deviances and when Little Red Riding Hood ends up sleeping with the wolf at the end of the story, that's up to interpretation, she's between the paws of the tender wolf. That's insane. Like, between the paws of the tender wolf would have never come out of a Grimm's fairy tale. That sentence is so simple objectively, none of those words are crazy, but the fact that it is in such a recognisable story and alters everything about the story that we think we know is insane, and it's a massive feat. And I think the ability to flip these fairy tales, one, without them being like, I'm a woman and I'm so strong and I'm so cool and I don't need men, two, highlighting the need for sexuality and for lust, which links into the first point, not getting rid of the female, not reliance, but female interactions with men. That together culminates in something that isn't just feminist, but is sort of just radical in general. it's saying that these narratives and these plot points that create quite predictable characters almost. So when you're reading a fairy tale, you know that one of them's the good one or the bad one, or you can easily tell that this is the helpless damsel in distress, and you know when the prince comes in because he's on his little horse and he's got his sword and whatever. She takes those and she's like, well, what if I flip that? What if the wolf that's terrifying actually just needs to be tamed by my sexually promiscuous Little Red Riding Hood, and why not? You know? I think if you're going to imitate something, might as well question its foundations. And once you question those foundations, everything starts to crumble. And everything that we know about fairy tales as a genre, which also is mental because half of the fairy tales that we read don't include fairies, right? Think about Little Mermaid. It's about mermaids. It could be a mermaid tale, but it's not actually a fairy tale. The idea of fairy tale is more how it makes you feel and the atmosphere of it rather than what's contained within it. So we have two versions of the same fairy tale. So for example, Little Red Riding Hood for the Grimm's brothers and The Company of Wolves from Carter. It's the same fairy tale. The atmospheres at base level are the same, but the nuances within the stories are so different, and it allows Carter to play with her material and basically say, I'm going to imitate these people, but I'm going to make it modern and interesting, because we can lose things to time and things can feel outdated just naturally when they shouldn't. I'm very strong of the opinion that, like, even though, for example, you'll read Dracula and there's anti-Semitism in it, or different novels and there'll be racist remarks, etc. Obviously that is horrific to us, but you can't then just disregard that novel or that work because it doesn't fit with our notions of societal, what's right in society. We can critique the authors for doing those things, obviously, and say that that was horrific and that we've learnt from that, and we haven't learnt from that even. But you can't disregard these like pillars of the canon. But I think people do start to do that because we can get bored of it, right? Like Charles Dickens, people are bored of him sometimes. I understand that he can be a boring writer. I love him personally. But I think Carter being able to take something so traditional and what could be so boring, because we all know the plots so well, and we could all rewrite Cinderella and Little Red Riding Hood and The Little Mermaid. The fact that she takes those and says, let's look at them again, let's look at them differently, it provokes us in a new way. You don't have to create new original material to provoke people. That's just not, that would be just an unachievable sort of dream, basically. But more into sort of the feminist side of it, obviously, because that's what her work is about, some people would say. I think it's more about sexual liberation generally. I don't think, especially for 1960s and 70s, she could have gone down the route of like man-hater. I don't think any of her male characters are demonized, and I don't think any of her female characters are heralded. I think they're just people. So the Magic Toy Shop, for example, the main character Melanie ends up in a relationship with this guy who's older than her. She's underage and he's older than her. But the way that she writes it and the way that she creates these relationships and these interactions between people is just human connections and human conditions. And once you pair that with the fairy tale atmosphere and the narrative, these things feel right. Then they may not be right. They're not immoral or moral. They're just interactions between people that allow us to understand that people are complex. Even if we want to bottle people up into being female or male and adhering to the gender binary, which Carter sort of flips on its head anyway, in, for example, The Passion of New Eve, one of her novels, she's working at things in a different way and she's not the typical feminist, I definitely would argue. And I was reading this really interesting article by Rebecca Mumford in her book Revisiting, I'm reading off my iPad, by the way, can't do anything without my iPad. Rebecca Mumford she edited a book called Revisiting Angela Carter, and in the introduction, I want to say it was, she said this, which I think we need to dissect or think about. It's, quote, concerned as she, Carter, is with entering the male-dominated territories of decadence, surrealism and pornography, the problem with Carter is that she often writes against the feminist grain. First of all, the title of the book, Revisiting Angela Carter, revisiting, just like how Carter is revisiting narratives. I thought that was just a nice title. I think that quote is insane, right? First of all, it's adhering to the idea that there's one notion of feminism which just has never been true. First wave, second wave, third wave feminism, we already know that's never been true. So speaking as if it's a definitive, the feminist grain, is mental. Each person can have their own experience and own relationship to feminism. Even if we all want equality, we can all have our own opinions on certain aspects of it. That is completely fine. That's how anything works. That's how any ideology works. You can have a core structure and then still have bits sprouting off of it. That's just natural. And it says male-dominated territories of decadence, surrealism and pornography. And I do totally actually agree with that these are male-dominated territories. But I feel like Mumford is saying that because she's concerned with entering them, that she's not fighting back at them. She's trying to just enter them and like infiltrate these spaces without questioning them. I don't think that's true at all. If we look at Carter's, so obviously she's known for her fiction, but one of her non-fiction works called The Sadian Woman basically talks about Marcus de Sade, who was known for sort of mistreating women and raping women, but he also wrote a lot of work basically, and it was kind of like one of the first pornographers, kind of, not really. And she basically is striving in that non-fiction book for an amoral pornography and argues that pornography isn't a bad thing, which is so interesting. For us modern readers in this climate, Angela Carter didn't have Pornhub, OnlyFans, etc. Just Instagram on social media generally, where you can just see people in very little clothing. So I think, even though, yes, I know a lot of people will have a very different opinion now, but this is Carter speaking in the 1960s and 70s. And I think, again, she's just letting people know that having desire and sexuality is okay. She's letting these fictional characters know from these traditional tales that it's okay if you want to lay between the paws of the tender wolf and you're attracted to, scary man that the wolf is trying to represent. It's okay if you have these desires and lusts, and it doesn't make you sort of this immoral bad person. And one of my favourite quotes from, I've not read the entire thing, but one of my favourite quotes from the intro, I think it was, quote, "The primordial itch in the groin existed long before multinational business corporations and the nuclear family, and will outlast them just as it illicitly dominates them." I think that sums up perfectly the idea that what she is striving to write about and to contextualise and make people aware of is that sexuality is an inherent thing within the human condition, and that we don't exist without it. It's one of our core things, right? We eat, we sleep, and we have intercourse. That's kind of our core primordial purpose, really. And I think she allows the fairy tale genre, because of its existence as being undefined, as being a futile attribution to stories that are within themselves, have different genres, right? So Company of Wolves is a very different story to The Bloody Chamber. These are very different narratives, even if they can both be considered fairy tales. You might put them under different genres. One of them a thriller, one of them a murder mystery, one of them a romance, etc. So I think that just as the primordial itch in the groin existed long before multinational business corporations, I think the writer's ability to rehash, retell, reimagine original stories existed long before the notion that originality needs to be the main concern. I don't think originality has ever been a real concern for people who have the stylistic talent to make their reimaginings worthwhile. You can write a very bad fairy tale retelling, but Angela Carter did not. So I think this was more just defense of Carter, maybe, or a little discussion about intertextuality and how I think that we can understand and learn from different routes of feminism without agreeing with them. I'm not saying that I don't agree with Carter, I definitely do on a lot of things, but I know that a lot of people, 21st century especially, just wouldn't agree with some of the things that she's saying or some of the ways that she's talking about things, and that's fine. because then someone in 100 years could retell the Bloody Chamber and rewrite it and call it the Chamber of Blood or whatever, and do it more for the feminism that's appropriate for the next century. That's just how writing works. And I think once we get rid of the concern and the obsession with creating original art will become a lot more real and a lot more non-performative, let's say. So yeah. Bye!